Well, let's start a little visual today, shall we? Start with a little visual. What do you see? What do you see? What? What? No. Sounds like we're speaking in tongues out there. What do we see? All right, how many see a woman? You see the woman? How many see the sax player? All righty, let's try this one. What do you see? A rabbit. How many see a rabbit? All right. How many see a duck? I'm from Oregon. I see a duck. No question about it. Well, those, of course, are what we call optical illusions. And optical means vision. Illusion is something that isn't quite what it seems to be. So an optical illusion is something that plays tricks on your vision. These teach us how the eyes and the brain work together to create vision. We live in a three-dimensional world, and so our brain gets cues about depth and shading and lighting and position to help us interpret what our eyes see. But when we look at something that's two-dimensional, we look at those images, it lacks some of these cues, and because of that, the brain can be fooled, seeing things that aren't really there or blocking out things that are there. Now, John had a very clear purpose, clear vision for his writing of the Gospel of John, and we see that in 20:31. It says, "These things are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." John chose certain miracles and conversations and messages and events, hoping that people would connect the dots through them and see Jesus for who he really is. But some of the people read and heard and saw all the evidence, but they still saw him as a deceiver, an illusionist, or a hypnotist. Same way that some people see faith healers today. Now, the miracle that we're studying would be a tough one to fake, giving sight to a man who was blind from birth. But there are people that had so many blind spots when it came to Jesus that they couldn't even see the obvious. As with other miracles recorded in John, Jesus used them to illustrate deeper truths. And in this case, of course, he's going to be talking about spiritual blindness. As we'll see, that the Pharisees were not the only ones with misconceptions that needed to be cleared up. Matter of fact, the disciples themselves had a few blind spots, and we're going to be looking at that to begin with. And I've asked Sam Elliott to help me as a reader today. We were home for 2 weeks, and with 13 children around between the ages of 17 and 9 months, you're bound to pick up a bug. So this is the gift that my grandchildren sent me home with. So anyway, I've asked Sam to help me out with voice today a little bit by reading these scriptures. We're looking at John chapter 9, and we're going to see, first of all, some of the misconceptions that the disciples had about sin and suffering. First 5 verses.
"And as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, 'Rabbi, who has sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind?' Jesus answered, 'It was neither that this man sinned nor his parents. It was in order that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me as long as it is day. Night is coming when no man can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world.'"
The disciples held to the popular assumption that all suffering is the result of some sin, either in this life or maybe even in a former existence. That's right, many of the Jews in the first century bought into the teaching of Plato and the Greeks on this issue. They believed that sin in one life could result in terrible maladies in the next one, what we know as reincarnation. They even taught that it was possible for someone to sin before birth into this present life. Once the soul entered a body, went into embryo, it was contaminated with an evil impulse. And then this bratty child would begin kicking in the womb until he or she broke out. How many of you mothers think that you may have had one like that in your body at one time or another? So this man that was born blind, maybe it was because he was a real pain in the abdomen. We don't know. But even if the man himself was a saint in his former life or in utero, his parents may have been responsible for his problem. The idea came, by the way, from scriptures like Exodus chapter 20. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of their fathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. Today we wonder if his mother did something like abused alcohol or drugs or had an STD, promiscuous behavior that resulted in the blindness of her son. Now, not many people buy into the former existence idea these days, but there are certain diseases or disabilities that are linked to sinful or dangerous behavior. A man who smelled like a distillery flopped on a subway seat next to a Catholic priest. The man's tie was stained, his face was plastered with red lipstick, and half of an empty bottle of gin was sticking out of his torn coat pocket. He opened his newspaper and began reading. After a few minutes, the disheveled guy turned to the priest and asked, "Shave, Father, what causes arthritis?" "Well, mister, it's caused by loose living, being with cheap, wicked women, too much alcohol, and a contempt for your fellow man." "Well, I'll be," the drunk muttered, returning to his paper. The priest, thinking about what he had said, nudged the man and apologized. He said, "I'm very sorry. I didn't mean to come on so strong. How long have you had arthritis?" "I don't have it, Father. I was just reading here that the Pope does." In our day, we see a connection between sin and suffering that's linked to the AIDS virus. Now, we know that it comes from somebody who's HIV positive by having sex with them, using an infected needle, or receiving a contaminated blood transfusion. I had a cousin who died of AIDS. She was a nurse and she handled infected blood. Less than a year later, her husband died as well. Babies born to HIV-positive parents often develop it as well. When we or someone we love struggles with a debilitating disease, we ask questions like, what did I do to deserve this? Why is God punishing me? Or why is he punishing this person? I want to summarize for you what I think the Bible teaches about sin and suffering. First, all suffering is ultimately caused by Adam and Eve's sin in the garden. Genesis 2, verses 16 and 17, this is what God said. "You are free," he said this to Adam and Eve, "you're free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die." And of course they did eat, and their sin cursed not only themselves, but also the entire human race born from them. Their bodies and ours suffer from a variety of diseases and disabilities which eventually lead to physical death. Everything from colds to cancer, diverticulitis to diabetes can be traced clear back to Adam and Eve in Eden. Second truth, some suffering is directly connected to sinful behavior. Some suffering is directly connected to sinful behavior. Sometimes it's our own sin, and other times we might actually be innocent victims of the sins of other people. Galatians 6, verses 7 and 8, "Do not be deceived, God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. The one who sows to please his sinful nature, from that nature will reap destruction. The one who sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life." Now, earlier in the book of Galatians, we have a pretty good list of dangerous, sinful behaviors. Included in that list are acts of the sinful nature, sexual immorality, impurity and debauchery, idolatry and witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy, drunkenness, orgies, and the like. These practices and these attitudes can lead to severe physical, emotional, and spiritual consequences. But not only do they affect us, they can affect the people around us. They can actually affect generations to come from us. Because it's not just contained in our own bodies. Third thing we need to know is that all suffering can be used for the glory of God and the good of the sufferer. All suffering can be used for the glory of God and the good of the sufferer. In other words, the consequences aren't for our punishment, they are for our development. Sometimes it sets the stage for a glorious act of divine healing, as we're going to see in the case of this blind man. Other times, through a process of personal sanctification, where we become more like Jesus as a result of our response to the malady, our response to the problem. Many of you are familiar with 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where Paul talks about this. Paul, the apostle, of course, had the opportunity. It says that he went up into the third heaven and he received these divine revelations. He saw and heard things that nobody had ever seen or heard before. And there could have been a tendency for him to swell up with pride, with spiritual pride, because of this experience that he'd had, because of what had taken place there. And so he says, for that reason, God gave him some kind of a physical issue, some kind of a physical malady, a thorn in the flesh. And it was so hard, it was so distressing that he said, 3 times I went before the Lord and I earnestly prayed for healing. I prayed that it would be taken away. And God responded to him, and he said, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. And so he said, I'm not going to take it away. So I guess you could say in this case and in other cases, our sufferings can actually be like a canvas on which God paints some of his most beautiful works of art. I love Ephesians 2:10. We are his masterpiece, created in Christ Jesus for good works that God prepared long ago to be our way of life. If you are somebody that you know is struggling to understand disability or disease right now, I hope that this teaching clears up some of those blind spots. Listen to Jesus say to the man and to us, this happens so that the work of God might be displayed in your life. Let's move on to a second common blind spot, and this is about miracles and faith. Sam, if you would read verses 6 through 12 of John 9.
And when he had said this, he spat on the ground and made clay of spittle and applied the clay to his eyes and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. And so he went away and washed and came back seeing. The neighbors, therefore, and those who previously saw him as a beggar were saying, is not this the one who used to sit and beg? Others were saying, this is he. Still others were saying, no, but he is like him. He kept saying, I am the one. Therefore they were saying to him, how then were your eyes opened? He answered, the man who was called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So when I went away, then and I washed, and I received sight. And they said to him, well, where is he? And he said, I do not know.
The first is what Jesus did. He gave sight to a man who was born blind. Not only couldn't this guy see anything, he never had seen anything. So we're not talking about glaucoma or astigmatism or cataracts. Total blindness. He was blind. And everybody in town knew that he was blind. And when he could suddenly see, everybody knew that it had to be a miracle. It was not an optical illusion. This is not something you can convince yourself of that I can see now. It really happened. Imagine Stevie Wonder, or Ronnie Milsap, or Ken Miedema, or Andrea Bocelli, the opera singer, being completely healed of their blindness. No more dark glasses, or canes, or dogs, or assistants. Second fascinating thing about this miracle is when Jesus did it. That is before the man even thought about asking or believing. In other words, he had no faith. No faith had developed. No faith was demanded from him as a condition of being healed. Jesus initiated the whole thing for his own reasons. Why did he do it? Well, we can say that he did it to show compassion for a man in need. We can say that he did it to illustrate a truth he was about to teach about spiritual blindness. We can say that he did it to demonstrate his divine power, that he in fact was Messiah, God the Son. One of the most dramatic miracles Jesus ever performed was on a total non-believer. Imagine a street preacher goes over to Walmart here in town. There's a blind man there, complete with dark glasses, a white cane, a dog, violin, and an open case for contributions. The man is dirty and crude and angry and demanding and profane. Before the preacher introduces himself, before he shares the gospel, before he prays, before he presses for faith, he simply walks over to the guy, touches his eyes, and suddenly he can see. The lights go on for him. By the way, miracles have preceded faith in all the episodes that we've studied so far in the Gospel of John. There was no faith before water was turned to wine. There was no faith before the feeding of the 5,000 or Jesus walking on the water. Evidently, Jesus' works of power have more to do with his purposes than they have to do with our preferences, more than our desires or our hopes. Third fascinating thing I saw in this miracle is how Jesus did it. Here's mud in your eye. I did a Google search of that phrase. Here's mud in your eye. Isn't that wonderful that we can do those today? And it's used as a toast, a drinking toast, right? Clink. Here's mud in your eye. Where did it come from? Well, somebody said, well, it comes from farmers who clink glasses, and they would go out plow in the springtime, and they were following the horse, and if there was enough moisture, and when the horses are walking and everything, the mud is coming up in the eye, and so that it's actually a good thing, right? Mud come in your eye, that says it's good moisture, and you're able to plow, so may you have good plowing season. Others say, no, it came from horse racing fans, and they'd say that to one another, and so if their horse is really going crazy, and their horses are running so fast that it's hitting mud back in the eye of whatever's behind them, and so here's mud in your eye, may your horse beat the other horses. Others said, well, no, it comes from soldiers in foxholes, saying it's better to be down here with mud in the eye than it is to be pummeled with shrapnel. At least one of these slang historians, I'd never heard of a slang historian before, I guess if you want to give your life to something. So a slang historian believes that the mud in your eye thing comes from this Bible story in John 9. And so the mud was a medium of healing and well-being, like that beverage, like alcohol is supposed to do. Take a shot of this and you're going to feel better. Jesus performed some miracles with a command. He performed others with a prayer, some in total silence, and sometimes he did it long distance. It's almost like he purposely did his miracles in a different way every time. That may have been for fear that people would start to put their faith in the procedure rather than in his person or his power or his purpose. Because I'm sure somewhere on the planet there's somebody who is selling or providing miracle mud packs. And they're saying the miracle of healing is in the mud. And so you get this thing out and you send it out with your prayer letter. I love how Jesus is so unpredictable. He's so creative. He's so personalized in his ministry to people. He doesn't follow the same outline every time. And I use that either as an inspiration or as an excuse for doing things a little differently around here at each service. I used to tell the people at our church in Portland that if they really liked some unique thing that we did in the service, that I hope that they enjoyed it because we may never do it like that before again. I used to use this phrase with our staff. The worst thing we can do is whatever we did last Sunday. So we kind of kept things fresh and creative and doing different things in different ways. And I think I got a pretty good model in the way Jesus did things too. Always creative, always different, because it wasn't the method that made the difference, was it? It was his power. This miracle, of course, was a two-step process. First, he spits on the ground to make a little mud. If you want to make a little analogy from that, I can say ministry is sometimes kind of messy. That is in contrast to always being neatly organized, perfectly timed, and officially sanctioned. Sometimes Jesus uses messy things in our lives to get the work of transformation done. Then he tells the man to wash off the mud in a nearby pool. And that's when the guy's sight returned, when he did that. strongest show of faith that we have in this entire incident is when he did what Jesus said to do. Go wash off in this pool. There's probably some miracle that if you thought about it, you wish Jesus could and would perform in your life. And it would thrill you to the core. It would change you completely. Or at least it would get you through a hard spot. What's that big thing that you'd love to have Jesus do? Maybe it's physical healing for you or somebody that you love. Wouldn't it be wonderful to get the email this week that former Bethel pastor Dan Reimer completely healed of cancer and that his sight is returned to 100%? Wouldn't that be a great story to share? Maybe it's a prayer for spiritual renewal for somebody that you really care about. You're praying for their salvation, for revival, maybe for brokenness in their life, maybe for family unity or reconciliation where there's been estrangement. Maybe if you gave focus, it would be unprecedented growth and health in the ministry of our church. Wouldn't it be wonderful to see packed out services and hundreds of commitments to Christ, obvious spiritual growth and clear transformation and changes in the lives of people? Money enough to support a top-notch pastoral staff, missionary force, and ministry resources. I mean, God has done it for other people. He's done it for other churches through various means. Why not here? Why not us? Why not now? I think the Lord gave me some insight into those questions. It's one thing to believe God for those things, but it's more important that we learn to trust Him regardless of what He decides to do. That we trust Him regardless of what He decides to do. To say, I believe, Lord, that you're going to do what's best. You're going to do what's best. Now, this trust may be that of the blind man in this story who obeyed the most basic command. Jesus put the mud on the eye and He said, now wash it off. Go to that pool and wash it off. Is there anything God has commanded you to do that you have not yet done? Is there some point of disobedience? It's kind of hanging out there and you just kind of continue to put it off in your mind. Maybe a difficult thing, or it may not be that difficult at all, but you're just delaying it. One of the strongest expressions of this total trust is found in the book of Habakkuk. Now, there's a book you probably haven't read recently, Habakkuk. It's not tobacco, it is Habakkuk, chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. Look at it and listen to it. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. That, my friends, is an expression of trust that's not based on circumstances. Now let's quickly move on to another blind spot that Jesus addressed. And this one's about tradition and transformation. Sam, if you would read verses 13 through 23, John chapter 9.
They brought to the Pharisees him who was formerly blind. Now it was a Sabbath on the day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Again, therefore, the Pharisees also were asking him how he received his sight. And he said to them, He applied clay to my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Therefore, some of the Pharisees were saying, This man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. But others were saying, How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? And there was a division among them. They said therefore to the blind man again, What do you say about him, since he opened your eyes? And he said, He is a prophet. The Jews therefore did not believe it of him that he had been blind and had received sight, until they called the parents of the very one who had received his sight, and questioned them, saying, Is this your son, who you say was born blind? Then how does he now see? His parents answered them and said, We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But how he now sees, we do not know. Or who opened his eyes, we do not know. Ask him. He is of age. He shall speak for himself." And his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess him to be the Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. For this reason, his parents said, "He is of age, ask him."
We pastors and church leaders are sometimes prone to protect our tradition and to discount stories of transformation that happens beyond what we have planned, beyond our programs and systems and policies and strategies. I think our intentions are good when we put those things together, for the most part. But then when we get threatened, when God seems to work at things that are outside of the box, when he does things that are outside of the plan. Several years ago, our oldest son was in middle school, and the youth ministry planned an air band concert. Anybody remember an air band concert? Okay, some of you remember that? And I had a vague idea of what it was, but I decided to drop by and kind of check it out as I went in to pick up Kevin and his school friend, Stephen. And when I went into the auditorium of our church, it actually blew my mind and my traditions. Because what was happening was wild Christian rock music, students dancing all over the auditorium, pretending to sing and play instruments. We're talking the Holy of Holies, folks. We're talking about the place where I preach the word. And, there's kids all over the place, and they're doing all these wild and crazy things. And I had to escape, and I needed some peace and quiet, and also time to formulate a lecture for our youth pastor. And as I'm putting all of this together in my mind and trying to sort out my feelings, I get this knock on the door, and Kevin opens the door just like that. He says, "Hey, Dad, Stephen just prayed to receive Christ." Talk about taking the steam out of a rant. It's like, whoa, what just happened here? And as I try to process all of this, take the perspective, a bigger perspective of that, it probably saved our youth pastor's job, at least for a little while. Now, the Pharisees weren't wrong to check out the facts when this healing was reported. The principle here is not that programs and policies and strategies and asking questions should be thrown out. But the purpose for all of the things that we do should be evaluated based on the transformation of lives rather than the preservation of traditions. How are lives being changed and transformed in the environment of the ministries that we're doing? Among other things, the transition team that I've talked to you about quite a bit is evaluating Bethel's mission, vision, and values. And the purpose of doing this is to help your spiritual and ministry leaders, including Pastor Next, focus on the main reason why we exist as a church. And I don't know how the statement is going to come out in the end, but it needs to be something like, it's helping people encounter Jesus so that he can change their lives, right? It's the encounter with Jesus that changes people's lives. We need to keep that in mind when some ministry or worship style doesn't fit my preference, doesn't fit the way I think it should be done. Because Jesus has a way of breaking tradition and convention and doing things in different ways. Here's mud in your eye. Let's quickly move on to a fourth blind spot. This one is about witnessing and evangelism. Sam, if you would read verses 24 through 34, John chapter 9.
So a second time they called the man who had been blind and said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He therefore answered, "Whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that whereas I was blind, and now I see." They said therefore to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? You do not want to become his disciples too, do you?" And they reviled him and said, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he is from." The man answered and said to them, "Well, here is an amazing thing, that you do not know where he is from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he hears them. Since the beginning of time, it has never been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered and said to him, "You were born entirely in sins, and are you teaching us?" And they put him out.
With the way that this healed guy holds his own against the attacks of these religious leaders. Matter of fact, did you see, here's some pretty good zingers that he had in there for them. When they come to him again and say, "Well, tell us the story," or repeat the story, it's like he's being interviewed in the room by the police detective, "Tell us again exactly what happened." And he said, "Why do you want to hear it again?" "Oh, maybe you want to become a follower of Jesus." Like that, which they obviously didn't. And then later on, as the conversation continues, and he says, "How can it be? Why are you asking me these questions? You're the religious leaders here. You're supposed to know all these things. And here's a guy that just healed me, and you have no idea who he is or where he comes from or how he did it." And so again, holding his own. But the best thing he said is found in John 9:25. He said, "I don't know if he is a sinner or not. One thing I do know, and this, by the way, is the essence of a testimony. This is a witness statement. I was blind, and now I see." That's the story. I was blind, but now I see. He was simply telling what he had seen and heard and experienced. The guy was not a theologian, but he had a pretty good grasp on this basic truth about God. Reminds me of what an old Baptist preacher by the name of Vance Havner used to say. He said, "The happiest fellow on earth is a new Christian before he runs into too many Bible scholars." Most impressive thing about the way this man told his story and held his own is that he was not a Christian yet. He was not a disciple of Jesus. He was not a follower of Jesus yet. The price that he paid for his witnessing was being excommunicated from the synagogue. Now, some of us are thinking, what's the big deal? Why should that be a big deal? Well, first of all, if you're excommunicated from the synagogue, you were considered to be a dead man. You are dead to them. Matter of fact, they actually held a funeral. They had a burial. They considered you dead. Your children could not be circumcised, which meant that they were being shut out from any hope of God's mercy. If somebody in his family died, nobody would mourn with him. Nobody could comfort him from the synagogue, from that family. Nobody but his wife and children could even come close enough to touch him or embrace him. And maybe worst of all was the loss of his Social Security and benefits. Did you know they had them back in those days? If you were a Jew in good standing with the synagogue and you fell on difficult times, there was this fund, this poor fund that people gave to regularly, and you would be supported out of that fund. But if you're kicked out of the synagogue, you no longer have access to that. Obviously, the guy thought it was a pretty good trade-off. He traded his sight for his synagogue membership card. In his book, The Finishing Touch, Charles Swindoll gives us some good advice on giving a personal testimony, witnessing. He says, you want to be listened to, so be interesting. Avoid spiritual words and phrases that make no sense at all to the non-believer. You want to be understood, so be logical. And the best way is, I heard one guy say it like this: your life is a 3-point sermon. And this is the essence of what our testimony is. This is my life before Christ. This is how I came to Christ. Here's what's taken place in my life since I came to know Christ. You want the moment of your new birth to be clear, so be specific. And by that he means point to Christ, not to the church, not to the person who led you to Christ. I mean, those may all be part of the story, but the essence of transformation only happens when we come into connection with the person of Jesus, and so we need to be specific about that. You want your testimony to be used, so be practical. Don't make empty promises that aren't true. They're not really promises of God, like all your problems will go away. And finally, you want your testimony to produce result, so be warm and genuine. This is not like notches on the belt, folks, where we come up with our handy little thing, whether it's the Roman road or it's steps to peace with God or whatever tool we use, and tools are fine, but it's more than just sharing those facts, isn't it? It's about connecting with that person and being able to share heart to heart with them your own life. Well, let's look quickly at one final blind spot, and that is about sight and blindness. Sam, if you would read the final verses in the chapter, verses 35 through 41.
And Jesus heard that they had put him out, and finding him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered and said, "And who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have both seen him, and he is the one who is talking with you." And he said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshipped him. And Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may become blind." Those of the Pharisees who were with him heard these things and said to him, "We are not blind too, are we?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have had no sin. But since you say, 'We see,' your sin remains."
I love the way that Jesus goes back when this whole thing happens, and he closes the deal with this healed blind man. And you can see the progression now of this man's faith. In verse 9, he refers to him simply as the man they call Jesus. In verse 17, he says he is a prophet. In verse 31, he refers to Jesus as, quote, the godly man. And then in verse 38, he says, "Lord, I believe." He connected the dots, and he saw Jesus for who he really was. Some of you here may be able to identify with this healed blind man. You've experienced blessings from the hand of God throughout your life. The country that you live in, the family and friends that you have, the job that you go to, maybe even the healing you've experienced from a disease or an accident. And you're grateful to God. And you don't mind saying so. And beyond that, you may believe that Jesus was a true historical character, a figure. He was an extraordinary teacher. He lived a high moral life. But have you connected the dots to realize that he's more than all of that? Jesus is the one who went to the cross for you, for your sins. He's the one who rose victoriously from the grave and who is alive today in heaven at the very right hand of God. And he is praying for you. He's interceding for you. He's the one who has authority to forgive your sin, to come into your life, and to make you part of his forever family. He wants to be your rescuer. And more than that, he wants to be the commander of every part of your life. If you're not sure, if you've not consciously given your life to him, in just a moment, I'm going to give you an opportunity to do that. If you haven't yet taken the connection card from your bulletin, I hope that you'll do that right now and kind of let us know what's going on with you. And maybe we've touched on some blind spots today. Maybe some blind spots that you've had about sin and suffering. Maybe some blind spots about miracles and faith. Maybe it's about tradition and truth. Maybe it's about witnessing and evangelism. Maybe it's about true sight and blindness. Lord, thank you so much for including this wonderful account in your word, Book of John. And so many truths, and preachers like me have been going through this passage for eons. Christians have been reading it and studying it for a long time. And yet every time we dig in, it seems like there's something new, something that you want to bring to our attention, some area of perception or understanding that's important for us right now. And I pray that, Lord, has been true today. And I would ask, Lord, that you do the work in us that only you can do. Incremental work, sometimes in big leaps and bounds, sometimes just an inch at a time. But whatever it is, Lord, I pray that your word will continue to do, working with your Spirit to transform us into the person you want us to be. And I especially think today, Lord, of people in this room who maybe don't know for sure that they've fully committed themselves to you, to the person of Jesus Christ. And I pray that today will be that day for them. And so some of you may want to pray right now a prayer something like this. It says, Jesus, I'm connecting the dots. It's starting to make more sense to me now. Who you are, and what you do, and why you do it. And so today, on this last Sunday of July in 2019, Jesus, I commit myself wholly and completely to you. I ask you to come in, to forgive my sin, to place your Holy Spirit in me. And I'm told that one of the things he does is to teach, and I pray that you'll continue to help me grow in my understanding of who you are and what you want from me. If you made a commitment like that to Jesus today, would you let us know on that connection card? Or maybe you're still in process and you still got a few blind spots that you'd like to discuss with somebody. Let us know that as well so that we can help you in that way. Other things going on in your life, prayer requests for people that you care about. We appreciate you letting us know what's going on. And so I ask that you'd fill that out with just a line or two so that your staff and elders can continue to support you in prayer. And then in a few moments when the offering is collected in those bags, you can place it